So one of the things that we can use a for loop to do is to keep a running total. This is where we diverge back into the mathematics centric idea of computer science. And again, I know it seems and sounds and is potentially boring, but it is absolutely positively the case that the reason we develop programming languages is to do tedious mathematical works for our, purposes much more quickly and with a repetition that we as people just don't have the patience or the time for. So a loop takes care of that. It gives us that repetition and it's faster than we can accomplish, and it will run for as long as is necessary without growing tired or making mistakes. And one of the things that we see the first application of this for is for the idea of a running total. So I do just want to walk our way through 5.7, and we'll look at two things here. We'll look at an accumulator, so a running total, and we'll also look at creating rather a user-defined number of loops in a for loop. So this particular example that we can see that starts here on 261, and you can see the code right here behind me. It's program 5-12. I'll just scroll up a little bit more so we can see a little bit more. We have an integer for a number of days. Now I'm going to ask the user to enter how many days they want a sales total for. So the user could enter 2, the user could enter 5, the user could enter 5 million. It doesn't matter. And we're going to use that int days to manage how many times it is that we iterate through our loop. So first and foremost, lines 13 and 14, I'm going to ask the user for how many days, and they're going to enter that. You'll notice again, I can use the cin object here as opposed to getLine because days is an integer, and with integers we can use cin. I cannot tell you how many times I saw in the challenge problems for 4, using the cin to get a two like a first name and a last name, and creating those issues that come with keeping that buffer open for the cin object as opposed to the get line when we are using strings. So that's a little bit of a diversion here, but for many of you it will help you calibrate, I hope, help you calibrate on when to use cin and when to use getLine. So lines 13 and 14, we are getting from the user how many days worth of data we are going to enter here. So remember, this could be 2, this could be 10, this could be 5 million, and our loop is going to accomplish exactly what we want it to be, with the same lines of code, and it's going to do that with unknowable numbers of iterations, unknowable numbers of iterations, my mistake, guys, iterations, and that number is going to be given to us by the user, so not by us, the developer. So next, on line number 17, and I'll just go up a little bit more here so we can also see what the output would look like. So we set up our for statement. So remember, again, we start with our keyword for, all lowercase, and then we have a set of parentheses. Inside of our parentheses, we have initialization, the test expression, and the update expression. So first and foremost, I'm going to set my count at 1 here. The reason we're going to do that is we're going to use count as a display and as a mechanism to iterate through our code here. So in our previous example in 5.7, we said computer scientists should get used to starting our counters at 0. That's true. This one, we are using this counter to, to show the user what number it is that they are iterating through. It's okay to use the 1 here. The other thing we could do is when we're looking to display what day it is, we would just do count plus 1, because that way it accounts for that n minus 1 issue we would be having, so the off by 1 error. So remember, if we start our counter at 0, the first time the user enters something, it's the 0th entry. That doesn't make a ton of sense for the user. So as a developer, we have to be able to change the output so that it matches the user's expectation. I would suggest it's perfectly okay on line number 20. We'll just peek ahead a couple of lines here. On line number 20, towards the end of that line where you see the C out for count, I would say it's okay to start your counter at 0. And on line number 20, when you're going to interact with the user, simply say count plus 1, because it's not changing the variable, or the value rather, of your variable. It is just changing the output that the user sees. It is up to you, but don't use them interchangeably. You will get confused. So back to our for loop. So we have, inside of our for loop, you'll see I have declared and initialized int count equals 1. So that can be done here in one statement, like we mentioned in 5.7, or you could have earlier in the program, initialized that variable and declared it as well. But here, I think that this is much more clean. You do it right here inside of your for loop, and there's no question for the next developer in the chain, where that count comes from. It belongs to the for. So that is our initialization expression. After our semicolon there, you'll see on line number 17, count less than or equal to days. Remember, in our previous example, the count was n minus 1, the number of iterations we wanted minus 1, because we started our counter at 0. In this one, we're starting our counter at 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. So less than or equal to 5 gets us the proper number of iterations through our loop and accounts for starting at 1 instead of starting at 0. So that's our test portion of the expression. After our semicolon, you'll see that we have the update count plus plus. So that sets up our loop. So inside of our loop, and you'll notice here that we have a statement block, and that's because we have 4 lines of code that belong to our loop. And if we did not have the statement block there, the only line that would belong to the for loop is double sales. But it's worth mentioning something here. Inside of our loop, we are declaring that double called sales. This is not going to be of use outside of our loop, because this is where we are declaring it. So that means that the scope of sales belongs inside of the for loop. So what I'm saying to you here is that we have inside of our for loop declared 2 variables, int count and double sales. Both of those vanish as soon as we leave the scope of this for loop. So as soon as C++ comes to line number 23 and it goes to test that expression for the 5th time, and it determines that we are done here, or however manyth time, and it determines that we are done here with that for loop, int count goes away, double sales goes away. So we will see how that has more of an impact on us, not only just here inside of loops and files in chapter 5, but this is going to start to be a problem for you as a developer in chapter 6, is the idea of scope. So here inside of, and I do apologize, these 3 videos here to start us off in chapter 5 are going to be doozies. But here we've got the idea of scope, and int sales, double sales rather, and int count, both are terminated as soon as we leave the scope of this for loop. So we go through line number 19. We have entered into our for loop double sales. So we create a variable called sales. We do not have to initialize it because when the user enters the sales for the day, we are going to, assign that number to sales. Now what we're doing is we are using a combined expression, total plus equals sales. So what we're saying is we are taking total, which is declared outside of our for loop, above at the very top of our program. We are taking sales and we are adding to it the value that you just read from the user, or total, yeah. We are taking and adding to it sales, and we are going to save that back into our variable total. So then this line is done. We go back up and we check our expression. Is the count less than or equal to the number of days that the user entered? So this again shows up in the code sample at the end of the chapter. You can go check those out over there. But what we're saying is that the user gets to say with their entry on line number 14, how many days, how many iterations we're going to go through this. So when we're done, I'll just finish up with what's happening here on lines 26 and 27. We are going to show the user what the total sales are, and that's it. So you look at the program output. Over here it says, for how many days do you have sales amounts? We're going to enter 5. So remember, 5 is what the user enters here. So the reason we have less than or equal to inside of our for loop, so that's again up on line number 17. The reason we have less than or equal to is we've got that 5 from the user. And so we're going to start our count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If we did less than, we would iterate less than that 5th time. So that means we would only get 4 days worth of sales. That's our off by 1 error. So because we have less than or equal to 5, when we start at 1, we need that or equal to there. Otherwise, we will not iterate through our for loop the proper number of times. So here, because we have entered 5 days from the user, we go through our loop 5 times. So day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5 are entered. Inside of that for loop, every time the user enters a day's total, that is read in as sales. Sales are added back to total, and then we go through the loop again. Enter in sales, sales are added back to total, and we go through the loop again as many times as is necessary. And at the end, we get our total sales are 2,448 and change. If I did this again and let the user was to enter 7 times, we do not have to change the code at all. This loop will work. We run it again. The user enters 100 times. We do not have to change the code at all. This will work. You'll burn out your user because they don't want to have to enter 100 days worth of sales, but it'll work. The user enters 1,000,000. They are not sticking with you through 1,000,000 iterations of this, but the code will work. So we can have 2 things going on here. We've got the idea of an accumulator. Total is an accumulator. For every time we go through a loop, we accumulate more data there. And we also have a user-defined number of loops here. We ask the user to enter in, a number. That number is going to be the expression that we test against here inside of our loop, and you can see that there. There are code samples that do exactly this.